In the Latin, it's Sin-I Dee-I, but let's not posture. Sine Die sounds better than sayonora. Just before leaving, the legislature gives the city where it sits a new option for governing itself. So now what? The death penalty protocol in Arkansas, the so-called three-drug cocktail, on trial in federal court. But first, not new in Arkansas retailing, but newly legal, medical marijuana. An update from the state agency assigned as watchdog coming up on Arkansas Week.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. With no special session in sight, the General Assembly has formally adjourned. We'll have a quick look at that in a moment, along with the city administration still in its first months. But we begin with a drug that's only days from its first legal sale in Arkansas. Legal. Cannabis, marijuana. Policing the cultivation and processing and sale of physician-prescribed marijuana is assigned to a state agency with some experience in mood-altering substances, the Alcoholic Beverage Control Division. Its director is Dora Lee Chandler, who joins us now. Director Chandler, thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we have a mid-May target date for the beginning of legally authorized clinical sales of marijuana. Every agency, I guess, with a new mission is entitled to a shakeout period. Should we expect one?
It's going to take an adjustment period for monitoring and regulating those developers and getting things on the market. But we anticipate with the cultivators having begin harvesting the product that we should have some pretty smooth sailing to the dispensaries.
Is there an aspect of the mission that you are most apprehensive about?
You know, it's an unknown for ABC and the state of Arkansas, so we're just trying to tightly monitor and regulate the cultivators and dispensaries so that the patients are getting the product that they're expecting for their condition that they're seeking help with.
A word about that now. How much of this is going to be on site by the agency? How much will you rely on data provided by the processors, the distributors themselves?
So what we have is we have an actual seed to sell tracking and monitoring system, so the ABC enforcement agents can actually log on from their assigned areas and check to make sure that they are following the product from the time it hits the cultivators until it goes to the patient's pockets. They are required to go in and do actual inspections at least twice a year on those facilities to make sure they're inventorying, but they're doing a lot closer monitoring because of the newness of the product.
Well, transport is an element of that as well.
It is. We are working currently on third-party transporter license right now to be approved by the ABC board. The commission has approved their transporter licensings. As of right now, until those go into effect and we go through the promulgation of rules, the transportation will be left to the cultivators and dispensaries themselves.
But there still will be state inspection or regular oversight.
Absolutely. We will be overseeing that process as well and setting up inspections of those facilities and making sure that their storage facilities meet our standards.
There are the limited number of dispensaries, so I think, 8, I believe.
We actually have 32 dispensaries.
I mean, 8 districts, though.
Yes.
I had that confused, and I apologize for that. But do you see that as adequate? You and the health department work in your agency and the health department work in tandem.
Correct. We are working in tandem on that, and it's going to be dependent on the number of patient cards that they actually issue. It's been slow on the issuance of those cards, and I think the physicians are waiting to see when the product's going to be closer to being on the shelves. They are seeing an increase in, and it'll be up to the commission if the demand requires to open it up to the full 40.
Well, now there are about, I believe, in excess of 10,000 certified patients now with the cards required to purchase.
Yes, that sounds about right.
These dispensaries are, from your initial impression, analysis going into this mid-May project, which hasn't even begun yet, Are these situated sited, as it were, in locations that are going to be adequate to the demand?
It's our hope that they're going to be positioned in locations that are adequate to demand. Obviously, until the demand is there and we can monitor it, we will not know for sure whether or not there needs to be some additional distribution of those dispensaries.
Now, the startup date was pushed back.
Yes.
For what kind of headache or problem is that causing, or is that on the health department's end in terms of certification of patient?
It's actually the health department is monitoring that, and they are extending those licenses as we did when we issued the licenses for the cultivators and the dispensaries. Because they hit mid-year, we expanded that licensing time period so that their renewal date is not as quick.
Going in, are you satisfied with the security protocol at these installations?
Absolutely. I've actually toured some of them, and I've watched their security processes in place, and we're tightly monitoring to make sure that they're following those security policies.
And personnel?
Yes. We actually, to work at a dispensary or cultivator, they actually come through our program. We actually have to issue a RIC card, a registered identification card, to them, which means we have conducted a complete background FBI and state police background check on those individuals to make sure that they do not have felonies and should be allowed to work in those facilities.
And finally, this, there is some speculation, informed speculation, I would say, that in a couple of years there may be another initiative involving marijuana for open Colorado style sales. Can you give us any intelligence on that?
Well, we are hearing that that is possibly going to be coming down the pipeline towards us, the initiative to open up for recreational. I think at this point in time, Arkansas is looking at getting the medical marijuana up and running, because that's what the primary focus is to provide those patients with the need that they have sought for so desperately for these last few years. And once that need is hopefully satisfied, there may not be additional need to go further down to the recreational aspect, because the intent is to provide for those medical conditions that are believed to provide assistance from the marijuana.
And through all of this, it still remains a federally scheduled substance.
It is. It is federally scheduled and against the law in the eyes of the federal government.
All right. Laura Lee Chandler, good luck, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll be right back. Back with a Reporters Roundtable now. Rebecca Hall joins us from Arkansas Times, Michael Hiblin from KUAR, Public Radio in Central Arkansas, Steve Brunner, an independent journalist. And thanks to everybody for coming in. Steve, to you first. We had Sin-I Dee-I this past week, General Assembly final adjournment, no special session really in sight. What were the highlights? Mr. Hutchinson got everything he wanted.
I don't know.
Truly wanted.
I don't know if we've had. I'm sure we've had other governors who have had this much success with their legislative agendas throughout their entire governorship, but certainly he has got to be near the top. Once again, he had 4 major priorities coming into the session. He got all 4. His 4 T's. One was tax cuts. One was the transformation of state government, reducing the number of state agencies from 42 to 15. That's pretty major. One was a highway plan. We'll be voting on part of that in November 2020, unless there's some kind of successful court challenge. And also tax increases for highways, and finally teacher pay. And not only that, but nothing that he didn't want really got through. Yeah. I mean, little things, and of course he had to make some minor changes to what he was after, but mostly he got all of what he wanted, and no bills that would make it harder for him to recruit industry. You know, so basically a very successful session for Governor Hutchinson as always.
Yeah, and no vetoes. The first year during his time in office that's been the case.
And he got Arkansas Works renewed with barely a stumble. Everyone was holding their breath in case that federal district judge struck down the work requirement. Well, the judge did. I think just hours after the Senate voted, but he had only one quick, very brief stumble in the House. Got it approved again.
There was the one vote. Remember in his re-election campaign last year, he said, "I have to have the work requirement in order to get Arkansas Works passed." And yet this time, the work requirement had just been declared null and void and banned, and yet it got through, no problem. I think basically at this point, there's always the possibility for appeals. Plus, the legislature, this battle has been going on for so long. Eventually, it's just time to fight over something else. And so again, a very successful session for the governor. We'll see how the next one goes. The next one will be his last at that point. Maybe it'll be a little bit more difficulty getting everything he wants, but again, he called it the greatest of all time. Whether or not that's an accurate statement, who knows, but it was a very good one for him.
Yeah, by the time the House voted on Arkansas Works, I mean, earlier, as you say, I've got to have a work requirement to get Arkansas Works. Then it was, I've got to get Arkansas Works, so the budget collapses.
Right. Which has always been the case.
Yeah.
And civility, that was one of the key phrases that House Speaker Matthew Shepard used, especially compared to national politics. You know, there were big disagreements on a lot of issues, but overall, everyone got along during this session. Democrats said while they weren't happy with everything, obviously, that they were pleased that a few key items like proposed rollback of minimum wage did not go through. And overall, everyone seemed real happy with how things came out.
And we'll go back to highways, Steve, for just one quick second, because you noted we've still got an election coming up, and that's 2/3 of the money anyway. That's 2/3 of the highway program right there.
Right. The legislature did pass a 3-cent gas tax increase and a 6-cent diesel tax. That's done. Right. Now we'll have to vote on extending the 1/2-cent sales tax that was due to expire after 10 years in 2023. So that is about 2/3 of the program. It's needed to make the numbers work, but it will have to pass the voters, who will also be voting on a term limits change for the legislature, and also an amendment that would make it harder for really Arkansans and the legislature, but mostly Arkansans, to amend the Constitution.
All right. On Sin-I Dee-I Day, usually there's some backslapping, handshaking, and a cheer when the gavel comes down. This time, though, the Senate took action on a piece of legislation that will give Little Rock a different option for achieving one of Mayor Frank Scott's objectives, which is to revert from city manager to mayor alderman.
Yeah, so
mayor council.
Right, and in addition to that, this week we got handed down finally the release of the Scott script, which is Mayor Scott's kind of culmination of all the recommendations from the 8 citizen-led subcommittees that he put together right at the beginning of his term. And so most significantly in relation to that legislature, what was offered in the Scott script was from the Government Reform and I think Transformation Committee is 3 different options that they have presented to Mayor Scott for changing the current form of government. And so one of those would be the elimination of the at-large directors entirely. And so they're still kind of up in the air as to how many ward or city directors there would be and to replace that. So that's one of the options. The other way would be to create something that they're calling a super ward. And so that would also involve the elimination of at-large directors. But what would be in their stead would be a sort of combination of districts. And so then each of those super wards would have a director. And so they also don't know how many wards there would be in that case and how many super wards there would be in that case. But either way about how the government chooses to move forward, Mayor Scott would have voting power, which currently in the city board, he only votes to break a tie.
What's the chemistry, what's the temperature right now at City Hall in terms of changing?
That's a really interesting question.
You've got a lot of moneyed interest with a lot on the line. And
I think that the feeling right now at City Hall is really very much so one of anticipation. Everyone, now that this has been released, Scott has already made significant changes. I mean, he's heading 6 new departments that previously only the city manager took care of all 12 city departments. I mean, Frank is heading up fire, human resources, planning, finance. And so with that, I think people are really curious as to how he's going to handle all of those new responsibilities. And I think that is really What people are waiting on is to see how he's going to juggle all of those, especially because he has a whole different set of advisors than Mayor Stodola has. He hasn't kept on some of those previous people who have who had that experience with Mayor Stodola. And so I think the city directors, I think all of the press who cover City Hall as well, is really waiting to see how he continues to bear that new responsibility.
Well, mayors are entitled to their first 100 days. We're giving him about 130, 120.
Yes,
anyway.
and I mean, very frequently whenever Frank begins discussions, he says, you know, this is my 100th day in office. This is my...
Do you have, from your coverage, do you have a sense of how the city bureaucracy is responding to Mayor Scott?
Yeah, I mean, I've profiled several of the city directors, and that was back right when I first started at the time, so that was January, February. Obviously, things have progressed a little bit more now that Scott has really taken some more decisive action, but I think that initially some of the city directors were a little miffed that he had gone ahead and, taken control of those 6 departments and done things that were, we hear the word unprecedented a lot when we talk about what Scott is doing.
That's what he ran on, is it not?
Right, it is what he ran on, and so I think that overall the narrative that I'm getting from my coverage at City Hall right now is a little bit, I don't know how to choose the word lightly, but I think that people are a little afraid of how Frank is taking those new changes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think people are a little trepidatious.
Makes perfect sense, Michael.
It's been interesting to see a new governor in office, or a new mayor in office, and the reaction and the change he's talking about.
Definitely.
And as you said, this was a last-minute bill that came out of the legislature. That's very rare on Sin-I Dee-I to get this kind of change. And Mayor Scott said he wasn't pushing for that, but it was proposed, and we'll see.
Yeah.
His first big hire, a new police chief.
Definitely, yeah.
Who has his plate full.
Absolutely. I mean, 2 shootings within his first week. Yeah, Chief Humphrey has definitely had his hands full right out the gate. And, you know, Frank Scott called this hire the most important of his first term, if not the most important of his career as mayor. And so I think that a lot is riding on how Chief Humphrey continues to handle protests that have been going on since the shooting of Bradley Blacksher. And I was actually at City Hall recently when they protested on Markham, and he came out there and spoke with them, and he talks often about wanting to be a chief of accountability. He wants people to hold him accountable, and I think people are certainly going to take him up on that.
And I think the going out there and talking to people is key, where you actually make people feel like, their voice matters and you are listening, because then you had this Monday the protest at the Capitol, and that's where they weren't allowed to even have a podium, and they had a demonstration, and there was talk of police snipers on the roof of the Capitol and the building across the street, and the reaction, State Senator Joyce Elliott and others, was just like, well, this is really an overreaction to this. And I think the way you calm things is by actually getting out there and talking to people.
I agree.
What seems to come through is that this mayor, Mr. Scott, is determined, resolved to keep the lid on. That's a crude way to put it. But in these racially charged, you can't take race out of anything at City Hall. But in these especially charged moments following the decision by the prosecuting attorney, Pulaski, to not file charges against the officer in the Blackshire episode, is to lower the temperature, the social, cultural temperature in the city. He seems resolved to do that, even if it means not necessarily alienating, but raising eyebrows in other constituencies, for example, the police department.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that Frank really knows that he's tasked with a position that previous mayoral administrations have not been tasked with, in that he is the first popularly elected African-American mayor. I think the weight rests differently on his shoulders as a result of that. And so I think he's even more conscious of the way that his choices, his language, the way that he reacts to things, how that's going to impact the Black community, how that's going to impact law enforcement. And so I think that he's being very careful, understandably so, about the stances that he's taken, especially because when he speaks about the Blackshear family, he always says, they are in my prayers. I am thinking of them, but he's also very careful to say, I am also thinking of Officer Stark's family. And so in situations like that, I think it's really representative of how he is trying to still straddle that line. That makes sense.
Yeah. About 6-8 blocks away, Michael, in U.S. District Court, Arkansas's execution protocol. It's supposed to be like a 2-week trial. We've had a lot of clinical testimony so far.
Yeah, this has been interesting. I've been in there spending a lot of time in court watching the testimony, and you have a team of attorneys, the familiar people from the Public Defender's Office, as well as people like Jeff Rosenzweig, an attorney who's been arguing for death row inmates for decades. On the other side, you've got the top attorneys for the state from the AG's office. The key here is whether or not the first drug used in the execution process, midazolam, effectively knocks out inmates so that they don't feel the second and third drugs, which stop the heart and paralyze the muscles. And there's been a lot of discussion about 2 of the executions that took place 2 years ago when Arkansas was rushing, attempted to execute 8 inmates over a week and a half, and only 4 ended up being put to death, but 2 of those had reactions. In particular was Kenneth Williams, one inmate who lurched forward against the restraints in the death chamber and just seemed to show a visible reaction. So you've had a lot of experts who have been testifying about that. You also had some very graphic photographs shown of Williams' autopsy from his forehead, where apparently as he was bucking forward, it also bruises. The attorneys for the state say that the plaintiffs will not be able to prove this to meet the standard by the court. But very interesting, as we've had a lot of witnesses come up. We've had witnesses to the executions here. We've also had witnesses to executions elsewhere. On Wednesday, we had a professor of pharmacology talk about this drug, midazolam, and he said, exact quote, "For certain, it is going to cause severe pain because midazolam does not produce anesthesia." But then that was, the effort by the state to discredit him was, well, this textbook that you are co-author of has a chart here of drugs and under the uses for midazolam, anesthesia. So we're going to hear more of this testimony, expected to continue well into the coming week. But very fascinating and just a lot of emotions here, while at the same time also very scientific evidence being presented. A lot of states are watching this because many other states have switched to midazolam. So they will see. We had one of the attorneys for the plaintiffs. The plaintiffs are 18 death row inmates, and in making opening statements, one of the attorneys said, we could have, a trained marksman could effectively kill an inmate painlessly with one clean shot to the heart. So it's really arguing against and whether or not midazolam is effective for this purpose.
And you'll continue to monitor that. And thank you, Steve. We had a couple of minutes remaining. Drug story of a different sort, and that's the Attorney General has put Arkansas again in the plaintiff's column in new litigation involving opioids.
Right, last year she sued the three major opioid manufacturers. Today she announced that she is suing the 3 major opioid distributors, AmerisourceBergen, Cardinal Health, and McKesson. They control 85% of the market, $375 billion annually in revenues. Says that they were violated the Arkansas Deceptive Trade Practices Act by by the way that they marketed the drugs, not marketed, really the problem was that they did not do a good enough job of monitoring, reporting suspicious activity, and then reacting to it and trying to prevent that from happening. So in that way, we resulted in a lot of illegal diversions, the drugs getting out to where they were not supposed to go, and so now we're the 15th state to join in that, to sue independently those major manufacturers.
Are these going to be conjoined, these lawsuits, or combined, consolidated, I guess?
She said today that she was asked that question. She said, at this time, no.
We got to leave it there because we're out of time. Thanks to everybody for coming in. As always, we thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.